Craftworlds are cosmic lifeboats, the last remnant of a star-flung civilization all but consumed by its own hubris. Forever teetering on the brink of annihilation, the Asuryani fight to defend their existence with ancient technology and the power of prophecy. Now, with the Farseer's guidance, Altark, you shall slay all who stand in your way. Hello there, everyone. It is time to talk about our second of the Aeldari factions, and this time around we're going to be talking about the Asuryani, and where the Drukhari were glass cans and wanted to avoid confrontation in almost every regard, as well as perhaps being one of the easier factions. The Asuryani, as well as what the faction I'll talk about later, the Corsairs, implement a much more complicated type of mechanic to utilizing this fleet properly, and a lot of that comes down to the holofield itself. Simply put, how this works is so long as your ships are moving, you will charge up what would essentially be your shields, and this will give you a bonus based on how much it's charged up. So you will reduce the accuracy of all macro weaponry that are shot upon you, as well as greatly minimize, or at least have a really high likeliness of absorbing lance shots that come your way. In essence, the holofield is really the only type of defensive ability that can actually negate lance shots in any form of matter whatsoever. Whereas every other faction kind of has to deal with it over time, the Asuryani are almost unfazed by it due to their holofield absorbing a whopping 75% of all these lance shots that are coming your way. Do keep in mind that you will take damage over time if you prolong your engagements in such a manner, but the Asuryani are kind of built to kill things quickly. A lot of this comes down to how much more aggressive they're encouraged to be as opposed to the Corsairs and Drukhari, and that's because when you combo the holofield and the 67 armor all around that the Craftworlds have access to give you a very simple representation on how impactful this is, with the holofield fully charged you basically have 83 armor all around. Keep that in mind that it's not exactly 83 armor, for you're not quite benefiting from the holofield for the purposes of ramming or anything that just ignores the holofield altogether, but it gives you outstanding longevity for drawing out fights if it comes to that route. And in some ways, I would even argue it's better than just the straight up 83 armor that the Space Marines and Necrons have, for the holofield just gives you that chance to dodge shots completely, which is important when you consider the fact that critical hits can really screw you over if you were to suffer a critical hit really early on in the match. So in some ways the holofield is better, some ways it's worse, but just to emphasize its value, that should be how you should be approaching the holofield, at least when you're playing as the Asuryani, for the purposes of keeping it simple. But otherwise, the Drukhari, I mentioned how they are really ridiculous on doing damage in quick bursts and they have means of doing it. The Pulsars are the epitome of this route. They have an incredibly long rate of fire time, which can make them really awkward to utilize since you don't have an easy way to know when your weapons are recharged, and since they are the only weapon in most of your ship's arsenal, you will be flying around with these ships a good portion of the fight not really knowing when they're actually useful. They are, without doubt, one of the more complicated weapons you're going to have to utilize with the Asuryani fleet, let alone the Corsairs. But the star cans, the las cans themselves, are an incredibly potent weapon themselves, even just putting to shame the Imperial Navy's weaponry, especially when you combo that with, due to the fact that the lock-on was replaced with runic targeting node, which still gives you the 100% critical hit chance, but instead of extending the range, you get 270 degree arc for your las cans so long as that stance is active. They also have access to, simply put, the best fighters and best bombers in the game, where the fighters have an 80% dodge rating to avoid shots at them, and the Eagle bombers themselves also have a 50% chance to dodge point defense shots and fighters, which may not seem very significant, but in the later portions of a match, or when you're finding a target that's completely isolated like a light cruiser or frigate, the bombers, this resilience will be very impactful there to allow you to fixate all your bombers onto that target as opposed to relying a little bit on your fighters to kind of distract and help ensure the survival of said bombers. So you can get a little more damage potential that way. The bombers will also do slightly more damage than that of all the other factions in the game as well. It's very minor, but it pales in comparison to the potential of the torpedoes. This is exactly the same kind of stats and potential that the Drukhari have access to. The very key factor is that the cruisers themselves, as opposed to having 6 torpedoes, you actually have 8 to unload on your opponent. And when you combine this with the close range nature of the Asuryani, you have potential to obliterate anything in an instant, with the 9 damage that completely ignores armor. I am still of the fundamental belief that the Drukhari have some of the best fire potential of all the Aeldari type of fleets. The big thing to note is that the Drukhari have to consistently keep firing at their target to make full use of said weaponry. It's a lot more convenient with the 270-degree arcs of the lascans and the rate of fire of the pulsars that make it so much more convenient for the Asuryani to do their fighting and do maneuvers at the same time, without risk of losing out on your hull field or just leaving yourself vulnerable to fire in general. However, there are still a few noteworthy other changes to keep in mind, whereas the engine components on your Asuryani ships are unique in a way that you actually have multiple engine components that need to be destroyed before you are brought down to your half-speed trait that would normally be the result of an engine critical hit on any other factions. Whereas the light cruisers, the wraith ships, have 2 solar sails you would need to destroy before you lose all your speed, and never mind, both these would have to be destroyed to actually lose your wraithbone shift and falls maneuver, and the Phoenix ship itself, the battlecruiser, has 4 of these solar sails, making it incredibly resilient to being immobile. However, if you do lose your generators, you completely lose out on your hull field, which will hurt your survivability for drawn out fights, especially if your opponent is heavily utilizing lance weaponry. But with the average troop efficiency and a very respectable 30% chance to do additional troop damage, these ships are also pretty capable of whittling down the crew of a battleship or even just outright killing light cruisers and cruisers with relatively good ease. This is perhaps one of my most biased factions in all of the Armada 2 fleet roster, for I have a huge bias towards using torpedoes, for they have the biggest snowball potential and good use of them, especially in combination with other abilities like stasis bombs or just destroying the engines of your opponent's ships, make it a very easy means to get kills on your targets relatively quickly. The power of these torpedoes is undeniable, however, you only have 2 charges of these torpedoes with your cruisers, as opposed to what you would usually have in 3 charges, so each shot that you do has that much more emphasis that it has to connect. And when you consider that the light cruisers currently at the time of this recording only have a single charge of torpedoes, never mind only having 4 torpedoes available for their class, you probably will want to pursue wraith ships only for more utility or silent run type maneuvers as opposed to raw damage itself. So the most important factor you're going to have to keep in mind when playing out a match as the Asuryani is of course keeping the hull field charged up. It's a lot of ways. It can be really simple for, like I said already, the pulsars have a really long rate of fire, so there's really no need to keep your ships in close. Very comfortably disengage with the ship and just let them do a circle around the rest of your fleet in preparation for maybe its next attack run, or just disengage altogether. Whereas the lascans themselves, I kind of already hinted at with the 270-degree arc of your runic targeting node stance, you can very simply just have these do a broadside type of engagement arc, which your ships will just naturally circle around your opponent's ships to keep constant fire all the while moving their ships at full speed. Hell, if you ever activate runic targeting node, it will automatically set its stance over to the broadside type of firing arc, which is something you will still need to keep in mind, for there's a lot of situations where you may not want to circle around the ship. The best example being that you are on the rear of the ships and circling around them will kind of naturally have them fly outside your firing range. So do keep in mind that for those kind of niche situations. But otherwise, the bravery is really damn good, so morale is almost never an issue, at least until the flagship itself has been destroyed, but if it can, with the mobility, you can comfortably get to disengage or warp out, which helps alleviate a lot of the morale penalties that you would at least suffer with the flagship being out of play. But the raw meat of this fleet is the dragon ships, the cruisers themselves. They have the torpedoes to complement the raw firepower in close, and they have the points to kind of accompany multiple carrier ships if you choose to go that route. Although I would argue the Corsairs are better suited and better equipped to make use of the fighters and bombers, since again the Asuryani embody gain in close, when the torpedoes kind of overshadow the damage potential of the Eagle bombers, at least in short-term types of battles, you will have to make up the deficit a little bit there in the damage front. But the Asuryani do not sacrifice any of their mobility whatsoever to have this extra armor and extra firepower potential though. But as you do not have access to Shroud or any kind of stealth, any means of reliably gaining stealth, you are going to be taking constant pressure as a result if you're going to play the more longer drawn out type of games. But it is satisfying when everything goes right there. The runic targeting node complements incredibly well with the pulsars as well, since sadly reload does nothing for it, but the fact that you are boosting your critical hit chance to 35% for each and every one of the pulsar shots means that you can easily cripple the components that you want on a ship, provided of course you have brought the shields down ahead of time. So comboing this with either one type of flagship or ship that utilizes heavy use of las cannons to bring the shields down ahead of time, or even disruption bombs or other means to kind of take the shields down over time. You want at every opportunity to try and avoid hitting the shields with your pulsar shots, just because of the critical hit chance alone is so prevalent and so important to kind of set up your target for either torpedoes or anything else that you're going to use to kill them off. And you should not have to be too terrified about being in point blank range with a lot of these other factions as well, for your Blessing of Fall upgrade is just an armor piercing ammunition on crack by comparison. It gives you the armor piercing trait that the lances and pulsars have, so you are straight up doing far more damage than all that of the other factions by a large margin. And even with your higher armor, you can find like certain blind spots as well that make you almost perfectly safe from being shot at. As a perfect example, Adeptus Mechanicus, your heavy armor, if you can mitigate the damage properly, is going to be incredibly negligible against you. And it puts you within that sweet spot where the Nova cannons can do absolutely no damage to you during this period. And in a lot of ways, you can kind of abuse the Imperial Navy's lack of weaponry on the prow as well, so long as you account for torpedoes coming your way at certain opportunities. The extra armor does heavily allow you to brunt that ramming damage really damn well, although it is not encouraged by any means, but it's not as fearsome as it may seem at a glance, so long as you have your other ships able to assist you and even arguably take advantage of how aggressive your opponent is being, trying to get that ramming damage in. The sheer durability of your ship is astounding, and the hull field kind of does not really discriminate about how close you are anyway, for even Necrons with their 100% chance to hit with their lightning arcs is still going to miss a good large portion of the time just because of the hull field alone. So getting the most out of the potential of your hull field is pretty damn key. But with that said, one of the few weaknesses that you need to take very seriously as the Asuryani is, while I hinted at the solar sails of the light cruisers and the battle cruisers, but failed to mention the dragon ships themselves, is because they only have a single solar sail to them. They do not have the convenience of protecting their engines and the wraithbone shift like the other classes do, so you need to be aware that as soon as the engines go down, you lose your ability to disengage or reposition yourself. So emergency repair almost always needs to be available for that situation alone. Otherwise, you're going to fall apart incredibly quickly with the Imperial Navy spurs, or even just 83 armor ramming potential of the factions that do have them. Now I'm going to talk about the two fleets that I've been utilizing during my time with the Asuryani, and the main one that kind of symbolizes the strengths of what the Asuryani have to offer is, of course, the torpedo-focused type of fleet. This fleet utilizes 4 of the Firestorm Dragon ships with the pulsars, but you can fairly easily change the pulsars out for the las cannons if you feel like the pulsars may be a little difficult to utilize. And I have a Ghost Dragon ship with the carrier bays to kind of provide a little bit of vision and some needed utility for this fleet. For there are absolutely no frigates in this fleet at all, let alone any light cruisers to use for solid running and kind of like doing safe scouting for you. You are, in essence, completely blind. This is kind of a unique fleet that I've been personally utilizing that kind of has to rely heavily on either beacons or other means to get vision of your opponent, especially when you face off against like the other Aeldari factions or even Tyranids. This is, of course, one of the most common type of Asuryani fleets you're going to encounter, just because of how prevalent the torpedoes are in general. I already hinted at how the wraith ships kind of like are almost insignificant in the torpedo damage compared to the dragon ships, and it shows. Whether you're using the lascans or the pulsars, you have the raw burst potential to cripple something quickly, but if your opponent is prepared with supercharged void shields or other means to kind of get initiative on you, because again, you lack vision, you kind of need to manually fly within fire range or within sensor range of their ships before you can even engage in any manner, it can leave you very vulnerable to heavy lance fire, or even allowing them to prime disruption bombs or stasis bombs ahead of you just as you're preparing your attack runs. There are still ways for an opponent to blunt your aggression in very subtle manners. Supercharged Void Shield is kind of the most common type of response since it has such a short cooldown, never mind the unlimited charges on it, and it can negate all the pulsar shots if you are lined up in such a way that all your ships are going to engage at the same time. Whereas Disruption Bomb and Stasis Bomb is kind of without saying, if you get caught in either of these, you are left really vulnerable to very serious retaliation by whatever weaponry is coming your way, and the Stasis Bomb can be fatal, just because it primes for torpedoes or even ramming potential if your opponent is equipped for such a maneuver. And for my second fleet that I've been utilizing, although I will admit this is not really my skill set in utilizing an almost exclusively carrier style type of fleet, but it makes use of is perhaps one of the most beautiful looking ships in the game, the Phoenix, and 3 Moonray Dragon ships, but you can easily swap those out for the Ghost Dragon ships, which I would honestly argue may complement a carrier type fleet that much better due to the 270 degree arc that the lascans provide. You don't have anywhere near the burst damage potential that the torpedoes have to offer, let alone the numbers due to the inflated points required to utilize these carrier ships, but you have the convenience to chip opponents down slowly and steadily with your lascans at range, and the bombers allow you to engage almost globally. The trick here with this fleet is making sure your bombers and fighters are able to support each other, which can be incredibly difficult to do, as a lot of the times with this kind of fleet you are going to be playing more an objective based type of match, and naturally that requires you to split up your fleets into multiple portions to be able to grab multiple points at once and force your opponents to spread out and split up, which naturally combos with the fighters and bombers incredibly well. When they're separated, the point defense are far less effective as a result, and even with your ships spread out, they can gradually just pepper down your isolated ships there really effectively with the bombers alone, with a single fighter just slowly chipping down their point defense, almost exclusively while you're waiting for the bombers to come in piecemeal, or come in bit by bit. It is, as I said though, this kind of style is probably more encouraged for the Corsairs just because they have access to Shroud, so there's a little less, it's a lot more unpredictable about where the bombers and fighters are coming from, and there still needs to be slight bit of refinement with the fighters and bombers returning back to your ship, as you do have to wait for them to dock properly to be able to utilize your next wave of fighters and bombers, and when you factor in the high mobility and the wraithbone shift of your ships, you could be waiting an eternity for these fighters and bombers to actually dock, especially if you are under fire at this time. It leaves the bombers and fighters incredibly vulnerable to just getting shot down when they should have docked ages ago. And now for some of the key upgrades and skills that you'll want to look into. Disruption Bomb without a doubt is almost a must for any type of pulsar type of fleet strategies. This allows you to take out the shields incredibly well, and if your opponent does not take these seriously, then you are priming all your pulsar shots to just completely erase the cruiser or light cruiser that happens to get hit by this. Whether it be just destroying the ship outright in some manner, or just destroying every essential component that's on that ship, be it engines, generators, or anything else that it needs to actually fight. And the majority of the time you probably want to fixate on the cruisers or the smaller ships first, just because of the reliance of the critical hits with the pulsars. But with lascans, you do not need to rely on this nearly as much, just because your lascans are so effective at shooting down shields anyway. You just may want this handy for when you want to engage against a battleship, in that manner at least. Stasis Bomb complements the Aeldari type of playstyle incredibly well, since it's a lot more easier to put the Stasis Bomb on your fleet or in the pathway of where your opponent wants to go if they're pursuing you, as opposed to using it in an aggressive manner due to the limited range to deploy it. So when you feel the need to run away from a fight, just having this in the way is really damn convenient, especially for a 20-second duration where it's essentially a wall at that point. It doesn't even need to have a ship trapped in it for this to be valuable. Maelstrom is kind of one of your key abilities, is for destroying ships when you don't want to get in close with your torpedoes to get a killing blow. If an engine's destroyed or you face off against an incredibly immobile fleet, this is how you get easy damage in. However, you do need to still have the shields down for this Maelstrom to even matter, so you will need to make sure they are down. For a 3-minute cooldown on this ability, you are not going to get to use this very many times throughout a fight, so misusing it at least once is going to be felt. Wraithbone reinforcement, even though this is great for all the Aeldari factions, it does have a bit of diminishing returns because of already the 67 armor that you have on your Asuryani fleet. But since you are encouraged to get in their face more, this 83 armor still technically reduces the damage of non-armor piercing weapons in half. It is still effective, just really difficult to utilize for its full duration. You will want to use this when you expect the main brunt of the weaponry to hit you as you're doing your attack run. Now, Micro Warp Jump, normally this would be a recommended skill, but since it was just recently heavily nerfed to basically have a 15-second delay on it now, it can still be pretty useful for traversing the map. It's just not going to be utilized in any aggressive or defensive manner in any way at all, since it can be cancelled by simply boarding the flagship. So in truth, I am just bringing this up mostly to bring that nerf to light, if nothing else. And now for the upgrades themselves, there's some key ones that allows a little bit of versatility depending on your fleet. It goes without saying that the lascans can be an incredibly potent weapon in your fleet a lot of the time, and so Blessing and Fall complements the Asuryani playstyle that much more better, whereas Corsairs and Drukhari are going to have a far more difficult time utilizing this upgrade. But Asuryani are perhaps one of the best equipped to take advantage of this upgrade. With the 270-degree arc that you can get from the runic targeting node, and the higher armor you have in general, you can get constant fire and constant damage in for prolonged periods if you feel bold enough. It is definitely not for the faint of heart if you're going to go that route though. And King Crude batteries is very much for the same reasons there. While reducing your rate of fire by 60% is absurd, it can be a lot more trickier to utilize than Fall's Blessing, for the simple fact you won't have access to 270-degree arcs since it requires you to be in the reload stance to use this. So if you can reliably get behind the ship there, or if you're feeling bold enough, just keep your ship holding position at risk of losing your hollow field, this will get value for you. Accelerated batteries extending the range of your flagship can be really good for doing that chipping damage at a safer distance. Sure, it's only a single ship that will be having that extended range, but like I hinted at before with pulsars, it gives you another way to do damage, or at least help bring those shields down before you commit with your entire fleet. For the example of my torpedo fleet, my flagship has the lascans to at least start slowly chipping down the shields, especially on like a cruiser or light cruiser that has less shields in general, and I don't necessarily want to make use of the disruption bomb. It is kind of a weird circumstance that there's another upgrade that enhances the range as well in the Spearstone targeting node. This used to affect your entire fleet if you had the runic targeting node stance up, and as such it got nerfed to be only the flagship, so it is a bit of an awkward circumstance, but if you combo these two upgrades together, your flagship at least has 18,000 range with the lascans. Now Dire Avenger Honor Guard, this is a bit of an odd one, already having 30% chance of doing critical troop damage. So when you combo this with the fact that you have a 50-50 chance of doing 2 troop damage, you are pretty consistently going to do that 2 troop damage over time throughout the course of a battle with your boarding, and with some occasional 3 points of troop damage if you are getting lucky results. So boarding While it's not going to win you any matches, it is strong enough to take out some cruisers and light cruisers with relatively good ease, so it should not be overlooked. Spirit Crystal Lenses, this is more of a niche type upgrade for when you face off against other Aeldari, but this is definitely one of the weapons you're going to have to fear going up against when you're playing the Asuryani or even any of the Aeldari factions in general. For the Hull Field is such an impactful shield for absorbing damage over time, especially against lances, which are realistically one of the most reliable things to hit your fleet over the course of a battle. So you need to be very mindful of this, as it forces you to either do damage early on and start getting kills quickly, or it's going to eventually force you to disengage so that way you can get your Hull Fields charged back up, which can be a tricky proposition if you are constantly getting hit with scanner pulses of a frigate. Due to almost every single lance in the game having 18,000 unit range at least, it's going to be hard to stop getting hit by those things, even if you can already absorb them really damn well. And that has been my discussion of the Asuryani. This is perhaps up there with one of my favorite type of factions, although with the raw burst potential that these ships have to offer, can very easily seem very one-sided when things go well for the Asuryani, so it's hard to really dictate if they're in need of retuning just for the sheer power potential. For when they start losing, they can potentially lose in embarrassing fashions just because of how burst-centric a lot of your weaponry can be, especially with how my fleet has been with the reliance on the torpedoes and the pulsars almost exclusively. Very effective use of your supercharged void shield and your opponent just screening with their shields can almost immediately blunt your aggression with the pulsars. And if they know when the torpedo runs are coming, because a lot of the times you have no real reason to get in point blank range unless you're using your torpedoes, then you are not really doing the damage necessary, and your opponent can outlast you in some circumstances. And if you get rammed too much, even with your best attempts to minimize it, you can fall apart at the end. So I thank you all for watching this video, I hope it was helpful, and I will see you on the battlefield.